What is going on? Brian Carroll here, PowerXStrength.com HQ, coming to you today with another video. This one today is a frequently asked question I get. Brian, what is your opinion on Robert Oberst, however you say his name, strongman competitor that was on Rogan, I don't know, a couple years ago now, 3 years ago or say, that you shouldn't do deadlifts unless you're trying to be better at deadlifting. So people say, do you agree with it? What are your thoughts? Or how many give my thoughts in the context of what he says? So I don't necessarily disagree with what he's saying about deadlifting and the risk reward. The problem is he's wrong about NFL and college athletes in particular, let's say football players or whatever, they do deadlift. I've actually done a strength summit with all of the NFL head strength coaches. This was about 4 years ago. And I actually taught them techniques to hone in the squat and the deadlift and the bench press. So they actually do the deadlifts. A lot of them actually do trap bar deadlifts that are elevated. So here are my thoughts on that. Now that I pointed that out, that he was incorrect about that, because I've actually been to the Jaguars. I've worked with them, the Jacksonville Jaguars. I've worked with them in their training facility. I coach them on the deadlift. So I know they do deadlift, and other NFL franchises do deadlift. I know that for a fact, as well as colleges. But now that that's out of the way and they actually do deadlift, for the general person that is just trying to deadlift for fitness, I do agree. I think that the risk reward for deadlifts for a lot of people is not going to be worth doing the deadlift, especially from the floor. A good way to meet in the middle, as long as your form is good, pulling from an elevated block or from the rack can, a lot of the time, be better for you. The part where people end up getting hurt is usually from the bottom of the rep to about the bottom of the knee, where they round over and they get out of form. They have the flexion and compressive forces on the disc, and they get an end plate fracture and or a disc bulge. So that's a common injury mechanism that I see every day from athletes to lay people, general public, everyone in between, powerlifters, strongmen. So to recap, here are my thoughts. If you want to deadlift, make sure you use good form. Make sure that you lock in the core. You have a core of iron. You're using your hips to lift it. You're using your best leverages to lift the weight and not just using bad form and just jerking it up. So I talk about all these different things in my book, 10/20 Life and Gift of Injury. When I was lifting, just starting out for about 10 or 12 years, I didn't focus on locking in my core and using my lats and my pecs to post, using the anti-shrug, all these things that I talk about in my books and videos. So my bad form led to a lot of my injuries that I had, and it was my fault. No one else's fault, but my fault. So with that said, a lot of people aren't going to be able to keep good form deadlifting from the floor. So I would suggest those that want to deadlift and are stuck on deadlifting, that aren't trying to compete in powerlifting, that just want to build mass on their back and build their core up and different things like that, pull from an elevated position, maybe 4-inch blocks, maybe 6-inch blocks, maybe bottom of the kneecap for the rack pull, and make sure you lock your back in nice and tight before you try to pick the bar off the blocks or wedge it out of the power rack stands. So with that said, deadlifts aren't inherently bad. It just depends on the application. I just have a little bit of a problem with him saying that NFL people don't deadlift. That's wrong. That's wrong. So that's just, he doesn't know better. Maybe he's never been into an NFL training facility before. Maybe the one he went to didn't deadlift. Now, each strength coach brings in their own flavor. The strength coaches that I've worked with in particular, like Buddy Morris and other people like that, I don't want to mention anyone's name other than Buddy Morris. It's been very open about going to West Side and working at West Side. Tom Malinsky, different people like that have been open about getting some of their methodologies from Louis Simmons, taking time when they were in Cleveland. Both of those guys were in Cleveland with the Browns at one time. So they're only a couple hours away from Louis, and they learned a lot from Louis. So they did variations of the deadlift. They do belt squats. They do reverse hypers. They do glute ham raises. They do kettlebells. They do a lot of the strength training that strongmen and powerlifters do. With that said, each NFL team is going to have a different strength coach. They bring their different flavor in. So some of them may not deadlift, and that may be true, but I do know that some of them deadlift, but they don't pull from the floor. They pull from blocks. using a trap bar. Ideally for the general public, I would suggest doing something similar to this. But if you must, deadlift from the floor, from the floor with good form. Don't pull too often, don't pull too heavy. There's always a good rule of thumb of pulling every other week, especially if you're not competing. But to each their own. There's not just one rule across the board, one size fits all. So proceed with caution. But remember, at the end of the day, ask yourself, why am I doing this lift? Why am I deadlifting? If the risk isn't worth the reward and vice versa, then you may want to modify these exercises and do something else. So those are my thoughts on the deadlift. There is risk involved with pulling from the floor. You can mitigate some of that risk by putting the weight on blocks. NFL lifters do deadlift, they bench press, they squat, but they do it in modified versions. Also, positional players lift differently than skill players, than linemen, so on and so forth. So depending on the strength coach and how they work their groups and everything, some guys on the team may not deadlift at all. It just depends. So at the time that I worked with the Jaguars, I worked with a lot of the linemen, the defensive and O linemen. They deadlifted, the running backs deadlifted, they squatted, they benched, they floor pressed, they did all these things that powerlifters do. So once again, those are my thoughts on the general public deadlifting and risk reward from Robert Oberst on Joe Rogan 3 years ago. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for watching today. Please subscribe, like, and share if you enjoyed this video, and have a wonderful day.